On April 5, 1923, Lord Carnarvon, the financial sponsor of the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, died in a Cairo hotel room. The cause of death was listed as blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, followed by pneumonia. At the exact moment of his death, according to witnesses, all the lights in Cairo went out. Miles away in England, Carnarvon's dog let out a howl and dropped dead. Lord Carnarvon had been present when Howard Carter opened the sealed tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun just 5 months earlier. He was the first of what would become 22 people connected to that discovery who would die under mysterious circumstances within 7 years. Some died of infections that shouldn't have been fatal. Others collapsed suddenly with no clear medical explanation. Several committed suicide. One was murdered. Another simply vanished and was never found. Newspapers around the world began speaking of the curse of the pharaohs. They quoted ancient inscriptions warning that death would come on swift wings to anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. They tracked every death, building a mythology that has endured for over a century. But was there really a curse? Or is there a scientific explanation that the ancient Egyptians might have known? Something about the tombs they sealed that made them deadly to those who entered millennia later. Modern microbiologists have found toxic mold spores, deadly bacteria, and even trace radiation in sealed Egyptian tombs. Some researchers believe the ancient embalmers deliberately incorporated poisons into the burial chambers. Others think the deaths were simply coincidence and media sensationalism. This is the complete investigation of King Tut's curse, the story of an archaeological triumph that became a deadly mystery, and the question that remains unanswered. Did the pharaohs possess knowledge of biological warfare that killed intruders 3,300 years after? To understand the curse, we must first understand the boy whose tomb would become the most famous in history. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE, during one of the strangest periods in ancient Egyptian history. His father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who tried to revolutionize Egyptian religion by abolishing the worship of multiple gods and establishing the worship of a single deity, the sun disk Aten. This religious revolution was deeply unpopular with the powerful priesthood and the people. When Akhenaten died, his revolution died with him, and Egypt rushed to return to traditional beliefs. Tutankhamun came to the throne at approximately 9 years old, around 1332 BCE. His original name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but early in his reign, his name was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the restoration of the old gods. The young pharaoh was essentially a figurehead. The real power rested with older advisors, particularly Ai, who would become pharaoh after Tut's death, and Horemheb, a powerful general. Tutankhamun's reign was brief. Around age 18 or 19, the young pharaoh died suddenly. The cause of death has been debated for decades. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed that he suffered from multiple health problems, a severe bone disease in his foot, malaria, and genetic disorders, likely resulting from inbreeding in the royal family. But was his death natural? Some researchers believe he was murdered, a young king who had outlived his usefulness to those who ruled in his name. The back of his skull shows damage, though whether from a blow or from the mummification process is unclear. Recent scans show a broken leg that became infected shortly before death, suggesting he may have died from complications of an accident. Whatever the cause, Tutankhamun died young, and his death appears to have been somewhat unexpected. His tomb was small, probably not originally intended for a pharaoh. It was as if they had to bury him quickly in whatever space was available.
This small tomb, hastily prepared, would ironically ensure his immortality. While the grand tombs of powerful pharaohs like Ramesses II were looted in antiquity, Tutankhamun's modest burial was overlooked by ancient grave robbers. It remained largely intact for over 3,000 years, and when it was finally opened in 1922, death would follow those who entered.
Howard Carter was born in London in 1874. His path to archaeology was unconventional. He had no university education, but his father was an artist who taught young Howard to draw with exceptional skill. This artistic talent became Carter's entry into Egyptology. In 1891, at just 17, he was hired to travel to Egypt and make drawings of tomb reliefs and inscriptions. This was before photography became standard in archaeological work, so skilled artists were essential. Carter proved to be more than an artist. He had a natural aptitude for archaeology, keen observational skills, and an obsessive attention to detail. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming Chief Inspector of Monuments for Upper Egypt. But Carter was difficult to work with. He was stubborn, abrasive with colleagues, and had a fierce temper. In 1905, after an altercation with French tourists at an archaeological site, he resigned rather than apologize. This essentially ended his official career in archaeology. For years, Carter struggled, selling watercolors to tourists and doing minor excavation work. But he maintained his dream, to find the tomb of Tutankhamun. By 1907, most Egyptologists believed the Valley of the Kings had been exhausted. Every significant tomb had been found, or so they thought. But Carter was convinced that Tutankhamun's tomb was still there, hidden somewhere beneath the valley floor. He needed funding, and in 1907, he found it in the person of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was a wealthy British aristocrat who had come to Egypt for health reasons. He had been seriously injured in a car accident and suffered from weak lungs. Egyptian doctors recommended the dry climate. While recuperating, Carnarvon developed an interest in Egyptology and began funding excavations. Carter convinced Carnarvon to finance a systematic search for Tutankhamun's tomb. It would be the partnership that made history, and, some would say, unleashed a curse. For 15 years, Carter excavated in the Valley of the Kings, finding nothing. He moved hundreds of thousands of tons of sand and rubble. He explored every promising location. Nothing. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon had spent a fortune with no results. He told Carter this would be the final season. If nothing was found, the expedition would end. Carter returned to the valley for what he believed might be his last chance. On November 4th, 1922, a water boy working at the site accidentally discovered a stone step beneath the sand near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI. Carter ordered his workers to clear the area. More steps appeared, 16 in total, leading down to a sealed doorway. The door bore the seals of the royal necropolis and the name Tutankhamun. Carter sent an urgent telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England. At last, have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon immediately departed for Egypt. On November 26, 1922, in the presence of Carnarvon, Carter's assistant Arthur Callender, and Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, Howard Carter made a small hole in the second sealed door and held up a candle. "Can you see anything?" asked Carnarvon anxiously. Carter paused, then replied with words that would become legendary. "Yes, wonderful things." They had found it. The tomb was intact, and within weeks, people would start dying.
What Carter saw through that small hole would change archaeology forever. The flickering candlelight revealed a room packed with treasures. Golden couches in the shape of animals, chariots disassembled and stacked,
alabaster vases, jewelry boxes, statues, thrones, staffs, clothing, furniture, all the belongings a pharaoh would need in the afterlife crammed into a relatively small chamber. It was overwhelming. Everything was covered in dust and appeared chaotic, but nothing had been moved in over 3,000 years. Some items showed evidence that ancient thieves had entered shortly after the burial. Jars were opened, some boxes disturbed, but the tomb had been resealed in antiquity, and the bulk of its treasures remained. Carter, despite his excitement, was methodical. He knew this discovery required careful scientific documentation. Every object's position was recorded, photographed, and cataloged before being moved. The process would take years. Over the following weeks, the team carefully entered the first chamber, which they called the antechamber. They photographed everything from multiple angles. Carter made detailed drawings. They created a numbered grid system to track the location of every item. But the real prize still awaited. On the north wall of the antechamber stood 2 life-size statues of the pharaoh, painted black and gold, standing guard. Between them was another sealed doorway. Beyond that door lay the burial chamber and the pharaoh himself. On February 16, 1923, in the presence of Egyptian officials and a carefully selected group of archaeologists and dignitaries, Carter broke through the sealed door. Inside was something no one had ever seen before in Egyptian archaeology: an intact royal burial exactly as it had been left 3,300 years earlier. The burial chamber was small, almost entirely filled by an enormous golden shrine. The shrine was covered in blue faience decorative elements and protective hieroglyphs. When they carefully opened the doors of this shrine, they found another shrine, and inside that, another and another. 4 nested shrines, one inside the other, each having to be carefully disassembled. This process alone took weeks. Egyptian burial practices involved creating layers of protection, both physical and magical, around the pharaoh's body. When they finally removed the 4th shrine, they found a stone sarcophagus. Inside that sarcophagus was a coffin made of gilded wood, carved to look like the pharaoh in death. Inside that coffin was another coffin, and inside that was a 3rd coffin, this one made of solid gold, weighing over 200 pounds. And finally, inside the golden coffin, wrapped in layers of linen and covered in amulets and jewelry, was the mummy of Tutankhamun, his face covered by the famous golden mask that has become the most iconic image of ancient Egypt. It was the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, but by then, Lord Carnarvon was already dead. Chapter 5: The First Death. Lord Carnarvon's mysterious illness. In March 1923, just weeks after the burial chamber was opened, Lord Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. While shaving, he accidentally cut open the bite, and it became infected. At first, it seemed like a minor problem, but the infection didn't heal. It spread, causing blood poisoning. Carnarvon developed a fever. His condition worsened rapidly. By early April, he was gravely ill. He had developed pneumonia, and his weakened respiratory system, damaged years earlier in that car accident, couldn't cope. On April 5, 1923, at 1:55 a.m., Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo's Continental Hotel with his son at his bedside. At the moment of his death, witnesses reported all the lights in Cairo suddenly went out. The power failure lasted for several minutes, then mysteriously restored itself. No explanation was ever given by the power company. That same night, back in England at Carnarvon's estate, His dog began howling and collapsed dead. These details may be exaggerated or invented. They appear in newspaper accounts, but not in official records. But the death itself was real, and it happened just 5 months after opening the tomb. The newspapers were quick to sensationalize the death. "The curse of the Pharaoh strikes," screamed headlines. Journalists began researching whether any inscriptions in the tomb warned of danger to intruders. They found what they were looking for, or claimed to. Several newspapers reported that a clay tablet discovered in the tomb bore an inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Howard Carter vehemently denied this inscription existed. He insisted no such curse was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, but the story had taken on its own life. In truth, curse inscriptions did exist in some ancient Egyptian tombs, but they were uncommon and usually threatened spiritual consequences, not physical death. They were meant to deter grave robbers by invoking the god's wrath in the afterlife, not to kill intruders in this life. But whether real or invented, the curse narrative had been born, and more deaths followed.
In March 1923, just weeks after the burial chamber was opened, Lord Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. While shaving, he accidentally cut open the bite, and it became infected. At first, it seemed like a minor problem, but the infection didn't heal. It spread, causing blood poisoning. Carnarvon developed a fever. His condition worsened rapidly. By early April, he was gravely ill. He had developed pneumonia, and his weakened respiratory system, damaged years earlier in that car accident, couldn't cope. On April 5, 1923, at 1:55 a.m., Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo's Continental Hotel, with his son at his bedside. At the moment of his death, witnesses reported all the lights in Cairo suddenly went out. The power failure lasted for several minutes, then mysteriously restored itself. No explanation was ever given by the power company. That same night, back in England at Carnarvon's estate, his dog began howling and collapsed dead. These details may be exaggerated or invented. They appear in newspaper accounts, but not in official records. But the death itself was real, and it happened just 5 months after opening the tomb. The newspapers were quick to sensationalize the death. "The curse of the Pharaoh strikes," screamed headlines. Journalists began researching whether any inscriptions in the tomb warned of danger to intruders. They found what they were looking for, or claimed to. Several newspapers reported that a clay tablet discovered in the tomb bore an inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Howard Carter vehemently denied this inscription existed. He insisted no such curse was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. But the story had taken on its own life. In truth, curse inscriptions did exist in some ancient Egyptian tombs, but they were uncommon and usually threatened spiritual consequences, not physical death. They were meant to deter grave robbers by invoking the god's wrath in the afterlife, not to kill intruders in this life. But whether real or invented, the curse narrative had been born, and more deaths followed.
Over the next 7 years, 21 more people connected to the tomb's discovery would die. Here are their stories. George J. Gould, 1923, American financier and friend of Lord Carnarvon. He visited the tomb shortly after it was opened. He died of a fever in France just months later after returning from Egypt. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, 1923, Egyptian prince who visited the tomb. He was shot and killed in London by his wife just months after the visit. The murder itself was unrelated to Egypt, but curse believers counted it as part of the pattern. Colonel Aubrey Herbert, 1923, Lord Carnarvon's half-brother. He became ill shortly after visiting Egypt and died of blood poisoning in September 1923, just 5 months after his brother. Wolfe Jewell, 1924, British financier who visited the tomb. He died the following year of a sudden, unexplained illness. Archibald Douglas Reed, radiologist who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy. He became ill on the journey home and died before reaching England. Cause of death? Mysterious illness. Sir Lee Stack, British Governor-General of Sudan who visited the tomb. He was assassinated in Cairo by Egyptian nationalists. Again, the connection to the curse is dubious, but his death was added to the list. Arthur Mace, 1928, member of Carter's excavation team who helped open the burial chamber. He died in Egypt of arsenic poisoning. The source was never determined. Accident, suicide, or murder remained unclear. The Honorable Mervyn Herbert, 1929, another half-brother of Lord Carnarvon. He died in 1929 of malarial pneumonia, the same diagnosis given for his brother. Captain Richard Bethel, 1929, Howard Carter's personal secretary. He was found dead in his bed at the Bath Club in London. The cause was listed as heart failure, but he was only 46 and had been in good health. His death was sudden and unexplained. Richard Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, 1930, distraught over his son's death, Lord Westbury jumped from the 7th floor of his London building. He left a note mentioning the curse. His vehicle struck and killed a child on the street below, sometimes counted as yet another curse victim. Howard Carter's secretary's replacement, name unknown, 1929. The man who replaced Richard Bethel as Carter's secretary also died within months under mysterious circumstances. Some sources list his name as Edgar Steele. Professor Hugh Evelyn White, 1924, British archaeologist who worked briefly in the tomb. He hanged himself. His suicide note reportedly read, "I have succumbed to a curse that forces me to disappear." Gaston Maspero, 1916. Wait, this one doesn't fit. Maspero was the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service and had knowledge of the tomb's likely location, but he died in 1916, 6 years before it was discovered. His inclusion in curse victim lists is clearly erroneous, yet it appears in many accounts. This shows how the mythology became muddled. Ali Kamal Fahmy, 1923, already mentioned above, the Egyptian prince killed by his wife. Joel Wolfe, duplicate of Wolfe Jewell above. Professor Lafleur, 1920s, French Egyptologist who visited the tomb and died shortly after of a sudden illness. Details are scarce. Professor Leonard Derry, 1961, professor of anatomy who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy. Unlike most curse victims, Derry lived until 1961, dying of old age at 87. His inclusion in curse lists is questionable. A.C. Mace, 1928, associate of the Metropolitan Museum and Carter's assistant. He died in 1928, reportedly from a mysterious illness. James Henry Breasted, 1935, American Egyptologist who worked on translating inscriptions in the tomb. He died more than a decade after the discovery. And there were others, security guards, visitors, even the Egyptian laborers who helped excavate the tomb. Accounts vary wildly on the exact number and identities. By 1930, the pattern seemed clear. Involvement with Tutankhamun's tomb was statistically deadly. But was it? To understand whether a curse could be real, we need to understand what was actually inside that sealed tomb for 3,300 years. The ancient Egyptians were masters of preservation. The entire purpose of mummification and tomb sealing was to prevent decay and ensure the deceased's journey to the afterlife. They understood decomposition and worked to prevent it. The mummification process itself involved chemicals we now know are highly toxic. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, used to dry out the body. Exposure to large quantities can cause respiratory problems. Cedar oil and other resins used to preserve tissue. These substances release volatile organic compounds that in an enclosed space can reach toxic concentrations. Various plant extracts, including some with antimicrobial properties, others with unknown long-term effects when inhaled as dust. When Howard Carter and his team entered the tomb, they stirred up 3 millennia of accumulated dust. Every surface was covered with it. Dust from decomposed organic materials, from the linen wrappings, from dried resins, from the natron, from the decomposition of food offerings left for the deceased. Breathing this dust meant inhaling whatever it was in it. Modern microbiologists who have studied Egyptian tombs have made alarming discoveries. Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus, 2 species of fungus commonly found in sealed tombs. These fungi produce aflatoxins, which are among the most carcinogenic substances known to science. They can cause liver damage, immune system suppression, and, in acute exposure, death. A study published in 1999 by Dr. Gotthard Kramer at the University of Leipzig found that Aspergillus spores can survive for thousands of years in sealed tombs, becoming airborne when the tomb is opened. Coccidioides mites, a fungus that causes valley fever, a respiratory disease that can be fatal, especially in people with weakened immune systems. This fungus has been found in Egyptian tombs. Histoplasma capsulatum, another fungal pathogen found in ancient dust, particularly associated with bird and bat droppings. It causes histoplasmosis, a lung infection that can become systemic and fatal. Bacteria. Various bacteria species can survive in dormant states for millennia. When disturbed, they can cause infections, especially if they enter through cuts or are inhaled into compromised lungs. Lord Carnarvon had weak lungs from his car accident. When he breathed the tomb's air, his respiratory system was already vulnerable. The infected mosquito bite was the final trigger, but his exposure to whatever was in that tomb may have weakened his immune system. But the ancient Egyptians went even further. Some researchers believe they deliberately incorporated poisons into tombs to protect them from grave robbers.
The theory that ancient Egyptian tombs contain deadly biological agents has gained serious scientific credibility in recent decades. In 1986, Dr. Caroline Stenger-Philipp at the French Institute in Cairo published research showing that tombs sealed for thousands of years develop unique microbiomes, communities of bacteria and fungi that exist nowhere else on Earth. When these tombs are opened, these ancient organisms are suddenly exposed to oxygen, moisture from human breath, and new environmental conditions. Some die immediately. Others activate and begin reproducing rapidly. Archaeologists working in Egyptian tombs in the 1980s and 90s began reporting mysterious illnesses, respiratory problems, rashes, allergic reactions, and flu-like symptoms that appeared shortly after entering sealed spaces. One particularly alarming case occurred in 1973 when Polish archaeologists opened the tomb of King Casimir IV Jagiellon in Krakow Cathedral. Within a few weeks, 4 members of the team had died. Investigation revealed the tomb contained deadly concentrations of Aspergillus flavus fungal spores. This incident prompted a wave of new research into the tomb curse phenomenon. Scientists began to take seriously the idea that ancient tombs were genuinely dangerous, not because of supernatural curses, but because of biology. Dr. Ezzedine Taha, a biologist at Cairo University, published research in the 1960s theorizing that ancient tomb builders might have deliberately introduced toxic spores into burial chambers.
His evidence was circumstantial but intriguing. Tombs built during certain dynasties showed higher concentrations of specific fungal species that had little reason to be there naturally. Could the ancient embalmers have been engaging in primitive biological warfare? We know the Egyptians had sophisticated knowledge of plants, poisons, and preservation. They knew which substances could kill and which could prevent decay. Is it so far-fetched to imagine them intentionally sealing deadly spores alongside the pharaoh? But Dr. Taha never got to complete his research. In 1962, he died in a car accident shortly after announcing his theory. Some curse believers point to this as yet another victim, a man who came too close to revealing the truth. More likely, it was tragic coincidence, but the pattern of deaths, both ancient and modern, connected to Egyptian tombs is difficult to completely dismiss. In 1949, an engineer named Luis Bulgarini proposed one of the most exotic explanations for the curse: radiation poisoning. Bulgarini theorized that the ancient Egyptians might have had access to naturally occurring uranium ore and used it to protect tombs. Egypt does have naturally occurring uranium deposits, though they were not exploited until modern times. The theory was this: if radioactive material was placed in the tomb, it would emit radiation for thousands of years. Anyone spending significant time in the tomb would receive a dangerous dose, leading to illness weeks or months later. This would explain several aspects of the curse: the delayed onset of illness. Radiation sickness doesn't appear immediately. The variety of symptoms. Radiation affects different people differently. Why some people died and others didn't. It depends on exposure time and proximity to the source. The theory was largely dismissed as pseudoscience when first proposed, but in the 1970s, researchers made an intriguing discovery. Some ancient Egyptian artifacts did contain traces of radioactive isotopes at levels higher than background radiation. A study published in 1976 analyzed samples from tomb walls and found elevated levels of radon gas, a radioactive gas that naturally occurs in rock and can accumulate in sealed spaces. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. Tombs carved into limestone cliffs, like those in the Valley of the Kings, can concentrate radon to dangerous levels. When the tomb is sealed for thousands of years, the gas accumulates. When opened, anyone inside is exposed. Lord Carnarvon's lung problems would have made him particularly vulnerable to radiation exposure. The damage might not have been immediately apparent, but could have weakened his respiratory system, making the subsequent infection fatal. Modern archaeological teams now carry radiation detectors when opening sealed tombs, and many Egyptian tombs do show elevated radiation levels, though not typically high enough to cause acute radiation sickness. So while the ancient Egyptians deliberately used uranium theory is almost certainly wrong, the possibility of natural radiation in tombs contributing to illnesses is scientifically plausible. If the curse were real, or if tombs were genuinely dangerous to enter, we would expect everyone involved to sicken and die, but that didn't happen. Howard Carter himself lived for 17 years after opening the tomb, dying in 1939 at 64 from lymphoma, a disease unrelated to tomb exposure. He spent more time in Tutankhamun's tomb than anyone else, yet he suffered no apparent curse. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, was one of the first people to enter the tomb. She was present at all the major openings and spent considerable time in the burial chamber. She lived until 1980, dying at age 79. Dr. Douglas Derry, who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy, handling the body directly and breathing the concentrated dust from the mummy's wrappings, lived to 87. Dr. Alfred Lucas, the chemist who analyzed materials from the tomb, lived to 78. Harry Burton, the photographer who spent months inside the tomb documenting every artifact, lived to 1940, dying of natural causes at 60. A statistical analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2002 examined the death rates of people exposed to the tomb versus a control group of similar age and occupation who were in Egypt but not involved with the tomb. The conclusion: there was no statistically significant difference in mortality rates. People connected to the tomb died at about the same rate as people who weren't. So why did the curse narrative take hold so strongly? Selection bias. The deaths that occurred were dramatic and well publicized. The survivals were boring and went unreported. If 22 people connected to the tomb died, but 200 people connected to the tomb survived, the deaths seem less mysterious. Confirmation bias. Once the curse narrative was established, every death even tangentially connected to Egypt was counted as evidence. Deaths from unrelated causes, murder, suicide, assassination, were added to the list. Media sensationalism. The 1920s were the golden age of newspaper sensationalism. The curse of the Pharaoh sold papers. Journalists actively sought evidence of the curse and downplayed or ignored contradictory evidence. The power of narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures. A mysterious curse is a better story than some people got sick from mold exposure and most people were fine. And yet, the deaths that did occur remain somewhat difficult to fully explain. Several were young, healthy people who died of seemingly minor infections that suddenly became overwhelming. The cluster of deaths in 1923 to 1929 does seem statistically unusual, even if not impossible.
In 2007, the Egyptian government announced plans to create a genetic profile of Tutankhamun using DNA extracted from his mummy. The project aimed to answer long-standing questions about his lineage, his health problems, and his cause of death. Several members of the research team reported experiencing unusual health problems during the project. One researcher developed a severe respiratory infection. Another experienced unexplained symptoms that required hospitalization. The media, naturally, began speculating about the curse again. The DNA project was completed and published in 2010, revealing that Tutankhamun suffered from malaria and a bone disease, likely contributing to his early death. The researchers who fell ill all recovered. But the curse narrative never dies. It's revived with each new excavation, each new discovery, each time someone falls ill after working with Egyptian antiquities. Maybe that's the real magic of ancient Egypt. Not that curses are real, but that they feel like they should be. In a world explained by science, there's something appealing about the idea that some mysteries remain, that the ancients knew secrets we've forgotten, that death and time and dust can still reach across millennia and touch us. Howard Carter once said, "Death is only the beginning." He was speaking of ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, but perhaps he was also speaking a deeper truth, about discovery, about curiosity, about the stories that outlive us all. The boy king died 3,300 years ago. His curse, real or imagined, lives on. Thank you for listening to this complete investigation of the curse of Tutankhamun. May your own encounters with history be fascinating, illuminating, and entirely curse-free.